Let's convert layouts, primitive shapes into meshes for use as landscapes, asteroids, or swirly things. Let's start with the basics, create a null and let's call it landscape. Close that down and hit P for properties. Now where we see this primitive type, we'll select shape. So we have a few to choose from. As you can see, we've started with a sphere, we've got a cube, cylinder, torus, cone, and you can even create your own. But I'm not going into that because quite honestly, it goes right over my head. Anyway, so we'll start with a cube. To see what we're doing, I'm going to pop over to the View tab here and I'm going to select the Add Viewport. Here's the viewport and we're going to turn on VPR like this. I'm going to optimize a bit by going to the camera. I'm going to turn off adaptive sampling. And while I'm here in the lights, or rather the environment light, I'm going to turn off the visible to camera. Okay, so shift click on the surface will bring up the surface editor. The first thing to know is these primitive shapes have no mesh and are saved with the scene, which also means it's conveniently added a surface to this shape without us having to do anything. We'll open the nodes. Now one of Lightwave's many strengths is its textures. Let's get a procedural node. If you click on this drop down, you've noticed that we have access to a ton of textures. To get the ball rolling, I'm just going to choose this dented texture here. I'm going to take the value and I'm going to put it into the displacement. Let's make this window a little larger here. Let's go back to our properties. Let's walk through a couple of these parameters quickly. Radius is pretty straightforward. Obviously, you can make it bigger, you can make it smaller. Let's make it a little larger here. The displacement height kind of does what it says on the tin, so let's make that larger as well. And that's already quite an interesting shape. And accuracy, contrary to what you might think, the smaller the number, the more accurate. Now for our demo, we don't need it to be this accurate, so I'm going to go to the maximum of 1, which I think means basically the least accurate. Does it go higher than 1? No, 1 it is. These primitive shapes are very useful without any displacements, but as you may be able to tell, as soon as you start displacing, render times can absolutely go through the roof. The other issue is that you can only see these displacements in VPR. So the question is, how can we convert these primitive shapes into something a bit more useful, like a mesh? Well, we can do that using OpenVDB. I'm going to leave this on plain, but I'm going to make it a bigger radius of 10. I'll close the object properties, double click on the procedural, and we'll just make the scale a little larger. You'll notice there's a bit of clipping up here, so I might take the foreground value down a little bit just to counter that. Here we go. This is what we have, just a single null with a primitive shape applied to it. Create a new null, call it OpenVDB, just so we can follow along. The landscape, we don't need it to render, and we don't really need to see it. Not that we can see anything, so we'll turn it off. We're going to keep this OpenVDB setup really simple. So P for properties, under object replacement we need that OpenVDB evaluator. So our landscape is applied to a shape object. So we'll go shape to volume. Source primitive is that landscape. And we need that to be a level set, which it already is. But we also need that to be in world coordinates. Now I'm not entirely sure what my scale is here, so I'm going to make the voxel size quite large. We'll say 0.8 and we'll work our way down depending on the scale. So we'll take the grid into the grid. Let's turn on the wireframe. Okay, so we have a very low res representation of that landscape. So voxel size we will take down incrementally, 0.1. The only downside to this technique is we're going to need to nudge the timeline. Now the keyboard shortcut is the left and right arrow key, which should speed things up a little bit. Obviously, smaller the number, the more voxels, the longer it's going to take. So if we go down to there, give the timeline a nudge, you can see it's thinking about it. We get a much more detailed OpenVDB at the expense of time. Now I'm going to go back to 0.1 just for this demo, just to keep things ticking along. What we could also think about doing is getting a filter, add a dilate, we'll fatten it up a little bit, And you may also want to get another filter and smooth it out a bit. Play around with the settings. Medium values, quite interesting. Gaussian will just smooth out those pieces. Perhaps turning up the iterations. Sometimes iterations work, sometimes the voxel offset works. It's a bit of a weird one which I've never quite got my head around yet. But for now I'm just going to use the grid on its own. Obviously we can go back and change this at any time, but for now let's just close that down. Let's go back to the surface editor. Now you'll notice that OpenVDB has its separate surface, but we want to go back into the landscape and have a play in there. I'm also going to open up the properties for the landscape, so we have access to these properties. And now it's kind of very much up to you to have a play. So for instance, displacement height, we can pump that up quite a bit. Remembering to hit the arrow keys left and right to update the timeline. With the procedural, don't forget these options here. And then you can start to play with the other textures. Just tweak the settings of the OpenVDB so they're not quite so dull. Change the texture, nudge the timeline, play around with the scales. We've reached an environment we like. We want to save this out as a mesh. The first thing you need to do is save your scene. I found this to be quite crashy, so yes, definitely save first. Once done, make sure your OpenVDB object is selected. And up in File, we'll go Save Transform Object. So let's just call this Land 1. There you go. Great, that's exactly why you should save. We're back. Let's instead go to frame 0, see if that makes any difference. Okay, OpenVDB selected, so we'll go to Save Transform Object. Fingers crossed. We've done it, excellent. Okay, so let's just load it up, check it has done what we think it's going to do. Land 1. Nice. So that's all ready for further manipulation, perhaps in Modeler. Perhaps a bit of metamorphic. Anyway, you get the idea with that, so we can close that down. Let's remove that. Back to the procedural. If you were lucky enough to purchase the IFW2 textures when they were about, definitely check out some of those because there's some absolutely amazing textures in there. It's very much a shame they're no longer available. If you don't have IFW2, don't worry because the RenderMan collection is still available on Dennis's site. I'll put the link below. And finally, let's not forget that this shape object is changeable. So if we don't like the plane, perhaps we want an asteroid. So there you go, you could literally whittle away hours fiddling around with this. And the nice thing is you've got quite a nice amount of detail there without that extra render hit. Here's a breakdown of that swirly thing. So it's exactly the same setup. I have an OpenVDB null here with the evaluator. This has been saved out to a sequence for rendering here, but all I've done is in this filter, I've dilated it and I've blurred it a little bit. And that's pretty much all I've done there. The base shape is just a plane, as I showed earlier. If we look at the surface editor, the OpenVDB mesh is just a principled BSDF here. And on the base, exactly the same setup as previous example. I'm literally just using a procedural with one of those lovely IFW2 space procedurals. I've set it to vortex. All I'm doing to get the animation is I'm adding a bit of animation on the position and the rotation. Just a bit of movement on the Y position. And I'm basically rotating it clockwise. Hopefully speak soon.